It wasn't supposed to be this hard. Honestly, when the Galactic Council declared war on humanity, most species thought it would be a short, clean affair. A quick campaign against these hairless, underdeveloped apes, and then they could all go back to their usual galactic politics and tea-sipping. I mean, come on, humans? These were creatures that had barely managed to leave their own solar system. They spent half their time squabbling over imaginary borders and the other half trying to blow each other up over resources they already had. Most of the other species didn't even take them seriously as a spacefaring race. The Blargani, a species known for their tactical brilliance and vast military resources, were the ones who pushed hardest for the war. After all, why not? Earth was sitting on a wealth of untapped resources, and the humans didn't even have planetary shields. Planetary shields, for God's sake? It should have been a cakewalk. The Blargani and their allies had invaded hundreds of worlds before, and it had always been the same. You land, you overwhelm the enemy with superior technology, and you force them into submission. Easy, right? Humans didn't even know what was about to hit them. At least that's what the Galactic Council thought. But then again, the Galactic Council wasn't human. War started exactly the way you'd expect. Blargani warships dropped out of Phi TL right on the edge of the Sol system, bristling with weapons that could level entire cities in seconds. Silver was a thing of beauty. Sleek, silver warships with enough firepower to reduce Earth to a smoking crater if anyone so much as sneezed the wrong way. The human military? Not so much. When the fleet appeared, humanity's response was laughable. Earth's defense forces scrambled to assemble a ragtag fleet of mismatched ships, half of which had probably seen better days during World War III, which was, by the way, not that long ago. Are those gunboats? One Blargani admiral asked, genuinely confused as he looked at the grainy scans of a human fleet. Not just gunboats, sir, said his tactical officer, suppressing a chuckle. It appears they've also deployed some old satellites as decoys. And, wait, is that a civilian freighter? It looks like they welded some scrap metal to the side of it. The admiral just blinked. They're joking, right? The tactical officer shook his head. It appears not, sir. Well, this will be over in a matter of hours, the admiral said with a dismissive wave. Prepare the assault teams. I want boots on the ground within the next rotation. And, for the first few hours, everything went exactly according to plan. The Blargani fleet sliced through Earth's defenses like a hot knife through butter. Human ships were vaporized, satellites destroyed, and orbital platforms reduced to space. The human capital cities were in chaos. The Galactic Council expected them to fold within a day, maybe two tops. But of course, they didn't understand who they were dealing with, while the Blargani commanders were patting themselves on the back and toasting to their easy victory. Something strange started happening on the surface of the planet. See, the problem with humans isn't that they're weak, it's that they're unpredictable. And as the Blargani would soon learn, humans don't know how to quit. In the first few hours, Blargani ground forces encountered light resistance from human military outposts. It was hardly worth mentioning. Small skirmishes that were quickly overwhelmed by the superior Blargani tech. The Blargani soldiers marched across the countryside, clearing out towns and securing supply lines, moving steadily toward the human capital cities. But then, the first sign of trouble came in the form of guerrilla tactics. Not from the human military, mind you. Those poor bastards were either dead or in retreat. No, this resistance came from the civilians, the farmers, the factory workers, the mechanics. And somehow, within a few short hours, the Blargani ground forces found themselves facing improvised explosives, hit-and-run attacks and traps. And it wasn't just one or two isolated incidents. It was everywhere. Humans had gone from screaming civilians to an organized resistance in the blink of an eye. Reports started flooding in. Sir, we've lost another supply convoy, one Blargani officer said, his voice shaking. They hit us with homemade bombs. The commander frowned. What do you mean, homemade bombs? We're using anti-gravity tanks. Their weapons can't pierce the armor. They didn't pierce the armor, sir. They flipped the tanks. The commander blinked. What? They flipped the tanks, sir. Used some kind of... Well, to be honest, sir, it looked like an old mining charge, but they timed it perfectly. It detonated right under the lead vehicle, and it sent the whole column toppling. The commander stared at the reports, completely dumbfounded. They're flipping tanks now? With mining charges? Not just tanks, sir, another officer chimed in. We've had reports of snipers taking out our officers. And now they're not even using energy weapons. They're using projectiles, old-fashioned bullets. How are they hitting our shields with bullets? The commander demanded. They're not aiming at the shields, sir. They're aiming at the joints. The commander rubbed his temples. feeling a headache forming. This wasn't supposed to be happening. Humans weren't supposed to be this adaptable. By the third day, the war was not going as planned. The Blargani forces, which had expected a swift victory, were now bogged down in a nightmare of guerrilla warfare. Every time they tried to advance, the humans were waiting for them with a new tactic, a new ambush, a new surprise. The Blargani soldiers, trained for traditional warfare, were completely unprepared for the chaos that humanity was throwing at them. They were used to fighting enemies who played by the rules, enemies who adhered to the tactics and strategies that were taught in every military academy across the galaxy. Humans. They didn't play by any rules, they played by their rules, and their rules were apparently, do whatever the hell it takes. The Blargani commanders, now frustrated beyond belief, decided to escalate things. They called in reinforcements, elite strike teams, precision bombardments, the works. If the humans wanted to play dirty, the Blargani would show them what real warfare looked like. But the problem was, every time the Blargani forces changed their tactics, the humans adapted right back. It was like fighting a swarm of bees that somehow knew how to operate heavy artillery. One Blargani general, Vorgol, stood in the command center of his flagship, staring at the holographic map of Earth's surface. His once perfect invasion plan was now a tangled mess of red lines and blinking warning signals. "They're adapting faster than we can deploy new strategies," one of his officers said, his voice tinged with fear. "Every time we try something new, they've already countered it." Vorgol slammed his fist onto the table. "They're primitives. How are they doing this?" "It's like they're evolving," the officer said quietly. "In real time." Vorgol scowled, his eyes narrowing. "No species can evolve that quickly." The officer didn't argue, but there was a glimmer of doubt in his eyes. Something about these humans didn't make sense. They weren't acting like any species the Blargani had encountered before. A week into the invasion, things had gone from bad to worse. The Blargani forces had lost control of several key supply lines, and their forward bases were being overrun by human insurgents. The humans had started using drones, repurposed to civilian models that had been outfitted with explosives. And the worst part? The humans were laughing the whole time. It was infuriating. Blargani commanders found themselves increasingly frustrated as they tried to regain control of the situation. They deployed advanced battle armor, cloaking devices, and even started using orbital bombardments to take out key human strongholds. But the humans just kept coming back, each time with some new trick up their sleeve. It was on the 7th day that the unthinkable happened. The Blargani's main command center on Earth, an impenetrable fortress of steel and energy shields, was attacked. And not just by human soldiers, by civilians, farmers, truck drivers, construction workers. They came in waves, overwhelming the Blargani defenses with sheer numbers. They had homemade weapons, they had repurposed farming equipment, and they had tanks, human-made tanks that they had welded together from scrap metal and old military surplus. "How are they there? How are they getting through our shields?" one Blargani officer shouted as the humans swore. "They're not targeting the shields," the tactical officer replied, his voice panicked. "They're targeting the power generators. They must have figured out how the shields are powered." The officer blinked. "But that's classified information. How could they possibly?" Explosion cut him off as the humans breached the command center. They had used old mining explosives again, this time to collapse the underground tunnels that supplied power to the base. Within minutes, the entire shield network went down, and the humans poured in, shouting and firing their crude projectile weapons. The Blargani officers watched in horror as the humans overwhelmed the command center. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. The humans weren't supposed to win, and yet they did. By the time the Galactic Council called for a ceasefire, it was too late. The Blargani invasion had been a complete and utter disaster. They had underestimated humanity at every turn, and now they were paying the price. The official explanation given by the Galactic Council was that the Blargani had overextended themselves, that the invasion had been poorly planned and executed. But the truth was, the Blargani had been defeated by something they had never expected: adaptability. Humans didn't fight like any other species in the galaxy. They didn't rely on rigid tactics or predictable strategies. They fought with creativity, with unpredictability, and with a sheer, stubborn refusal to give up. In the end, the Blargani forces were forced to withdraw from Earth, their once proud fleet in tatters, and as they limped back to their homeworld, they couldn't help but wonder, how could a species that was so technologically inferior have defeated them? The answer, of course, was simple. Humans adapt faster than anyone else, and that's what makes them terrifying. It didn't take long for the news to spread. Across the galaxy, species tuned into their holoscreens, jaws dropping in disbelief as reports of the Blargani retreat started pouring in. The Blargani masters of war, conquerors of 100 worlds, had been sent packing by a bunch of squishy, underdeveloped mammals. It wasn't just a defeat. It was a humiliation. Entire military academies spent months dissecting what had gone wrong. But what no one seemed to grasp was this. Humans didn't just adapt to technology. They adapted to everything. They adapted to war like a predator thrown into a jungle it didn't know existed until yesterday. What scared the Blargani the most? What made every commander on that battlefield start to rethink their place in the galaxy? Wasn't the human weapons or their tactics? No, it was how quickly humans turned every tool, every opportunity, every piece of seemingly useless junk into a weapon. It was like watching someone lose a chess match and suddenly start playing poker halfway through. "What in the name of the 7 stars happened out there?" screeched High Minister Vraluk, one of the more high-strung members of the Galactic Council. His chitinous mandibles clicked together furiously as he paced in the center of the council chamber, demanding an explanation. Admiral Vorkul stood at attention in front of the assembled council members, his usually polished uniform now slightly singed around the edges, a souvenir from the human freedom fighters who had blown up his personal transport the day before. He wasn't exactly in the best mood. "Well, Minister," he began, his voice tight, "we, encountered some unexpected difficulties." "Difficulties?" Vraluk spat. "Difficulties is when you can't get the invasion fleet through an asteroid belt. Difficulties is when 1 or 2 cities hold out longer than expected. He wasn't wrong. Every galactic newsfeed had shown the footage. Blargani tanks overturned, command centers reduced to rubble, elite strike teams taken down by human civilians wielding homemade explosives and duct-taped shotguns. It was the kind of footage that would go down in military history textbooks as a case study on how not to run an invasion. The chamber was filled with representatives from all over the galaxy, their faces grim as they processed what had happened. The Blargani weren't just any species. They were the military backbone of the Galactic Council. For them to be humiliated like this, it shook the entire galaxy to its core. "They used mining charges to flip our anti-grav tanks," Bort said, pinching the bridge of his nose. He still couldn't get over that detail. Mining charges, as if the humans had just gone, "Hey, let's blow up a few rocks to win the war." "And what of our ground forces?" asked Representative Talen, a tall, slender diplomat from the Sarnian system. Her 4 arms were folded, her face blank with what Vor could only assume was a mix of frustration and quiet panic. "Vortal's side? Our soldiers were ambushed at every turn. The humans employed guerrilla tactics unlike anything we've seen. They used civilian drones for reconnaissance, disguised their attacks as routine civilian activity, and even weaponized basic farming equipment." "Farming equipment!" Vraluk shrieked again, his voice breaking. "You're telling me our elite strike teams were taken down by tractors?" "Not just tractors," Vorgul said, a wry, almost bitter smile tugging at his lips. "Combine harvesters. I saw one rip through an entire platoon like it was cutting through wheat." The council chamber erupted into a cacophony of horrified gasps and murmurs. "They're savages," one representative muttered. "They're resourceful," another whispered, her eyes wide. "They're bloody insane," Vorgul added under his breath. Telen leaned forward. "Admiral, how did this happen? Humans don't have the technology to rival ours. Their weapons are outdated, their space fleet is laughable at best, and their infrastructure. Well, their infrastructure is primitive. How did they manage to counter your forces so effectively?" Vorzel shifted uncomfortably. "That's just it. They didn't rely on their technology. Every time we deployed a new tactic, they adapted. They repurposed old machinery, civilian tools, anything they could get their hands on. They set traps in places we didn't expect, used explosives made from household items, and used strategies that simply defied conventional logic. They don't fight like we do," he continued. "They don't fight like any species we've ever encountered. And worst of all, they're fast. They're so fast. We'd adapt, and by the time we rolled out our new strategy, they'd already countered it." Talen's brow furrowed. "Are you telling me that this entire campaign failed because they outsmarted you?" Zverkul's face twitched. "It's not just that, Representative. They're unpredictable. No battle was the same. No response was the same. They're not following the patterns we've been trained to recognize. It's like fighting a new species every single day." "Not unpredictability!" Vraluk interjected, his mandibles clacking in agitation. "How can that be? We've mapped every known species' behaviors. We've cataloged their battle tactics, their preferences, their reactions. Are you saying humans defy all of our intelligence?" Vorgul grimaced. It appears so. Grant Jenkins had never expected to become a war hero. Hell, he'd just been minding his own business on his family's farm in the Midwest when the Blarganis showed up with their shiny warships and all their pew-pew laser guns. Now, 6 days into the invasion, he was standing on the charred remnants of a Blargani tank, wearing a beat-up leather jacket and holding a rifle that had been in his family for 3 generations. "Well, I guess that's another one for the books," he said, casually spitting into the dirt as the remains of the Blargani platoon smoldered in the distance. "Who'd have thought farming equipment would be so good at flipping tanks?" His friend Derek chuckled, wiping the grime from his face. Derek had been a mechanic before the war. Now, he was some kind of makeshift military engineer. He was the one who'd rigged up the combine harvester that had torn through an entire squadron of Blargani soldiers the day before. The guy was a mad genius with a blowtorch and some spare parts. "I'm just saying," Grant replied, jumping down from the tank and wiping his hands. "If you told me last month that we'd be taking on a galactic military force with, like, literal tractors, I'd have told you to lay off the moonshine." Derek grinned, tightening a bolt on what looked like an old-school bus that had been converted into an armored personnel carrier. Moonshine didn't sound so crazy when it was all we had to disinfect bullet wounds. Now did it? They both laughed, the kind of laugh that comes from knowing you're somehow surviving a situation that's way out of your league. That was the thing about humans. Even when things were at their worst, they found a way to keep going. A little ingenuity here, a little insanity there, and suddenly you were a hero. Nearby, a group of civilians, men, women, kids barely out of high school, were busy reinforcing the perimeter of their makeshift camp. They weren't soldiers, not by a long shot, but they'd become one hell of a resistance force. In less than a week, they'd gone from scared civilians to seasoned warriors, and now they were standing toe-to-toe with one of the most advanced military forces in the galaxy. "You think they're going to keep sending more of those alien bastards our way?" Derek asked, glancing up at the sky. He squinted as if half expecting another wave of Blargani ships to drop out of the clouds at any moment. Grant shrugged. "Probably. But hey, if they do, we'll just hit them with the old switcheroo. New traps, new toys. I was thinking we could rig up the next batch of drones with paintball guns full of acid." "Acid-filled paintball guns?" Derek raised an eyebrow. "You sure you haven't been drinking that moonshine?" Grant grinned. "Nah, man. I'm just thinking outside the box. That was the thing about humans. You never knew what crazy idea they'd come up with next. By the time the Blargani commanders realized they were in over their heads, it was too late. The humans had turned Earth into a fortress. Not a traditional fortress, mind you. There were no towering walls or energy shields. No, the humans had turned their entire planet into a battlefield. Every field, every city block, every suburban cul-de-sac had become a war zone, and every human, whether they were a soldier, a mechanic, a farmer, or a high school gym teacher, had become a part of the resistance. The Blargani's elite forces, once thought to be invincible, were now retreating. The humans were everywhere, ambushing them from alleyways, dropping drones from the skies, setting up booby traps in abandoned grocery stores. It was chaos. Beautiful, terrifying chaos. And the Blargani had no idea how to stop it. This in the command center of the Blargani flagship. Admiral Vors stared at the tactical display, his hands trembling as he watched the red dots representing his forces blink out one by one. "This can't be happening," he muttered to himself. "This can't be happening. They're primitives." "Sir, the humans have surrounded our forward base," one of his officers reported, his voice tight with panic. "They're using, what appears to be farming equipment." "Farming equipment again!" Vorkul shouted. "How many damn tractors do they have?" "They seem to have quite a few, sir." Another explosion rocked the ship as a human drone, one that had been cobbled together from spare parts and God knows what else, slammed into the ship's shield generators, knocking out power to the lower decks. Vorkul grabbed his comms device, barking orders into the chaos. "Withdraw. We need to regroup. This planet it's not worth the resources. It's..." Another explosion, this one louder. "Admiral," one of his officers said, his voice trembling. They're boarding the ship." The officer gulped. They've rigged up a civilian transport ship with explosives, and they've breached the lower decks." Vergul froze, his mind racing. How had it come to this? How had they gone from an unstoppable military force to being boarded by civilians? This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Humans weren't supposed to be able to do this. They were underdeveloped, untrained, unorganized. But that was the thing about humans. They didn't follow the rules. They didn't care about how things were supposed to go. It wasn't long after the humans breached the Blargani flagship that the Galactic Council called for an immediate ceasefire. The Blargani fleet was in shambles, their ground forces decimated, and in their command centers overrun. The war that was supposed to be a quick and easy victory had turned into a full-blown disaster. For the first time in their history, the Blargani had been defeated. As the Blargani fleet limped back to their homeworld, battered and broken, the galaxy watched in stunned silence. How had a species as technologically inferior as the humans managed to win? How had they managed to not just hold off the Blargani, but defeat them? The answer, of course, was simple. Humans adapted. Faster than anyone else. And that, as the Blargani had learned the hard way, made them the most dangerous species in the galaxy. The war might have ended, but the galaxy's collective sanity had been shattered. The Galactic Council was in disarray, the Blargani were licking their wounds in shame, and the rest of the galaxy, they were still picking their jaws up off the floor. On Earth, meanwhile, the humans were doing what humans always did after a crisis, celebrating like maniacs. Because, of course, once you've survived an invasion from an intergalactic military power, what else are you going to do? Throw a barbecue, crack open some beers and tell war stories, naturally, in a smoky bar in what used to be Denver. Grant Jenkins sat with his feet kicked up on a table, nursing a beer as the remains of the resistance huddled around, swapping stories. So there I was, Derek said, wiping grease off his hands, sitting in my workshop, minding my own business, when suddenly, boom, the entire front window explodes. A Blargani strike team thought they'd get the drop on me, but what they didn't know was I'd already rigged the place with tripwires connected to about 5 propane tanks. Grant laughed. Classic move, man. Should have seen their faces when you blew 'em sky high, huh? Derek grinned, leaning back in his chair. Oh yeah, I mean, they've got all this fancy tech, cloaking devices, energy shields, and what do I use to take them out? Gasoline and good old American ingenuity. A woman named Rachel, who had become an expert sniper during the invasion, despite the fact that she had been a middle school gym teacher just a few weeks prior, nodded. It's like they didn't know what hit them. One minute they're strutting around like they owned the place, and the next they're running from farmers with pitchforks and welders with shotguns. I got 3 of them hiding behind an overturned car with nothing but a bolt-action rifle. I think they underestimated our flexibility, Grant said with a smirk. The way I see it, they've probably never had to deal with an enemy who changes the rules every time the game starts going south. Another laugh rippled through the bar. That was the thing about humans. They didn't have one set of rules. Hell, they didn't even play the same game half the time. You could call them primitive, you could call them chaotic, but that's exactly what made them so damn dangerous. And the galaxy had just learned that the hard way. The once mighty Blargani military command sat in stunned silence. The once proud, disciplined officers were now demoralized, hunched over holoscreens showing footage from the invasion, footage they wished had never seen the light of day. Each scene was a fresh insult to their legacy of military dominance. There was the footage of an entire Blargani tank battalion getting flipped by homemade explosives, Grant's handiwork. Another clip showed a group of human civilians, for Star's sake, storming a Blargani outpost armed with little more than Molotov cocktails and hunting rifles. But the worst part, the part that kept playing over and over in their heads, was the humans' laughter. They laughed while they fought. They laughed while they charged headfirst into danger, laughed as they rigged up half-baked weapons that probably shouldn't have worked but somehow did. It was like they didn't care about the odds. The more impossible the situation, the more they seemed to enjoy themselves. And that terrified the Blargani. They had expected a swift, clean victory. Instead, they got chaos. And chaos was something the Blargani were woefully unprepared for. Admiral Vorgul stood in the center of the command room, his eyes fixed on the holographic map of Earth, now covered in dozens of red markers that showed every point where the Blargani forces had been overwhelmed by the human resistance. How? Vorgul muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. How did this happen? One of his officers, still nursing a broken arm from the human boarding party that had overrun their flagship, cleared his throat nervously. Admiral, it seems the humans. Well, they fight differently. They don't follow standard tactics, and they don't react the way other species do. They improvise. Vorgul turned to him, eyes narrowing. Improvisation? That's what you're calling this? The officer gulped. Yes, sir. They're unpredictable, and they don't care about losing. If they get knocked down, they just get right back up again. And every time they do, they come back with something new, something we didn't see coming. They learn, Vorgul said bitterly. Faster than we can adapt. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. The Blargani had prided themselves on being the best warriors in the galaxy. Their tactics were flawless, their technology unrivaled, but none of that mattered when you were fighting an enemy that didn't play by the same rules. Vorgul clenched his fists. We'll need to rethink everything. Our tactics, our technology, our assumptions. If the humans could defeat us like this, then we're not as invincible as we thought. There was a collective shudder in the room. The Blargani weren't just dealing with the fallout of a failed invasion. They were dealing with a full-blown existential crisis. If humans could win, then what other assumptions about the galaxy were wrong? Back at the Galactic Council, the fallout from the war was reaching a boiling point. Representatives from every species were now gathering to discuss what had gone wrong, and more importantly, what to do about the humans. This can't go unanswered, growled Councillor Sarn, a hulking insectoid from the Throck Empire. His mandibles clicked together angrily as he paced the council chamber. The Blargani's defeat makes us all look weak. If word gets out that we were bested by primitives, it could destabilize the entire balance of power in the galaxy. The room buzzed with anxious murmurs. The Cerzarnian representative, Talon, folded her forearms and raised a thin eyebrow. Perhaps the problem isn't the Blargani's defeat, she said, her voice calm but sharp. Perhaps the problem is that we have misunderstood humans entirely. There was a ripple of agreement through the chamber. Though Sarn wasn't having it, misunderstood. You make it sound as if there's some kind of mystery to be solved. They're not. They're primitive, chaotic. We need to respond with overwhelming force, put them in their place before they become a bigger threat. That's exactly the problem, Talon shot back, her eyes flashing. They are a bigger threat, and you're missing the point. They don't follow the same rules as we do. Every species in this galaxy has evolved to follow certain patterns of war, patterns that we've spent millennia perfecting. Humans, on the other hand, they adapt, they change. The more you push them, the more they evolve. And we need to stop them before they evolve further, Sarn growled. Stop them? Talon smirked. Do you think that's even possible? Did the Blargani stop them? A heavy silence fell over the room. Look, woo! Talon continued, addressing the council with a voice full of authority. What we saw on Earth was not an isolated incident. It wasn't just luck or chaos. Humans are dangerous because they thrive on adversity. The more desperate the situation, the more they seem to come alive. Their unpredictability makes them the most dangerous foe this council has ever encountered, and if we keep underestimating them, they won't just survive. They'll become unstoppable. But how could a species so underdeveloped become such a threat? Another counselor, a reptilian from the Drakari Coalition. Tell inside. That's exactly what we need to figure out. And that the galactic powers still reeling from their unexpected defeat, a new priority began to emerge. Understanding humanity. If they couldn't be easily conquered or contained, then perhaps they could be studied, dissected, analyzed. After all, if the Galactic Council could figure out what made humans so dangerous, they could prevent the rest of the galaxy from suffering the same fate as the Blargani. That was how Dr. Lisvar, one of the galaxy's leading xenobiologists, found herself assigned to the newly formed Human Behavior Research Initiative. The Galactic Council had tasked her and her team with uncovering the secrets behind humanity's adaptability. What was it that made them so resilient? What gave them the ability to adapt to war tactics faster than any other species in the known universe? She had started with interviews. First with a few Blargani soldiers who had survived the ground war, then with members of the human resistance who had been captured in the early days of the conflict. What she found was troubling. So you're telling me, she said, her voice carefully measured, that you managed to build a working rocket launcher out of spare car parts and some leftover fireworks. The human, a scruffy-looking man named Joe, scratched his chin thoughtfully. Yeah, more or less. Had to get a little creative with the ignition system. But once we figured out the right timing, it worked like a charm. Dr. Var blanked. You improvised a rocket launcher. Out of fireworks. Joe grinned. Yep, pretty wild, huh? We lit up one of those Blargani command centers real good. Didn't know what hit 'em? Do you often improvise like this? Joe's grin widened. Lady, that's what we do best. It wasn't the first time she'd heard something like that. The more humans she interviewed, the more she realized that their greatest strength wasn't their weapons, their technology, or even their resilience. It was their creativity. The Blargani had thrown everything they had at them, and the humans had responded by turning junk into weapons, farms into fortresses. They didn't just think outside the box. For humans, there was no box. As the reports from the Human Behavior Research Initiative circulated through the Galactic Council, the other species began to realize just how dangerous humanity really was. On the Thruk homeworld, military leaders held emergency sessions to discuss how to fortify their defenses. The Thruk had always prided themselves on their overwhelming force and technological superiority, but now they weren't so sure. If humans could turn farming equipment into weapons of war, what would they do if they ever got their hands on advanced galactic tech? On the Drakari moon of Valis, high-ranking officials debated whether to open diplomatic channels with Earth. After all, if you couldn't beat them, maybe it was better to be on their good side. Meanwhile, the Caesarnian diplomats quietly prepared to send their first emissary to Earth. They were pragmatic. They didn't want to fight humans, but they also didn't want to be caught off guard if humanity's unpredictable nature spread beyond their own solar system. All but in the darkest corners of the galaxy, whispers began to spread. Whispers of what humanity could become. What if the humans didn't stop at defending themselves? What if they decided to expand, to push outward into the stars and claim territory beyond their little death world? It was a terrifying thought. After all, if a species like humanity, unpredictable, resourceful, adaptable, decided to conquer the galaxy, who could stop them? Mass! For the humans, life had returned to something resembling normalcy. The cities were rebuilding. The farms were back in operation. And the makeshift military that had defended Earth was gradually disbanding. But there was a lingering sense of unease. The Blargani might have retreated, but everyone knew that this wasn't over. The Galactic Council might have called a ceasefire, but they weren't going to just forget what had happened. Earth had drawn a line in the sand, and the galaxy was watching. This in the newly formed Earth Defense Council. Military leaders, scientists, and diplomats gathered to plan for the future. Grant Jenkins had found himself unexpectedly drafted into the council, now serving as an advisor, a far cry from his days of working on the family farm. So what's the plan now? Derek asked, leaning against the wall as they sat around a table covered in maps, schematics, and hastily scribbled notes. Grant shrugged. Same as always. Be ready for whatever comes next. Rachel, the former gym teacher turned sniper, nodded. And if they come back? Grant smiled. Then we give them hell. Again. And that's the thing about humans. They might not have the most advanced tech. They might not have the biggest fleets or the strongest armies, but they have something no one else does. They adapt, and as long as they keep adapting, the galaxy will never be the same.